Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Whenever one discusses the burden of proof on the internet, there's invariably someone who pops up to say something like, if you don't believe in the burden of proof, why don't you believe in the flying spaghetti monster? Can you prove that he didn't create the universe with his noodly appendages? Sadly, that's actually better than what one typically gets. Rare among atheists, Pastafarians have a slight sense of poetry, putting them towards the top of the barrel. That's on the floor of the sub-basement. Anyway, a friend of mine, Eve Kaninen, likes to summarize this approach with the following meme. The short version is that if you don't put your trust in the burden of proof fairy, you will be eaten by the you have to believe everything monster. Or in other words, the only way to protect yourself from believing everything you hear is to demand proof from the people who say it. But this is not, in fact, the only way to not believe everything you hear. Another way to not slavishly believe everything that you hear is to think about what you hear and rationally evaluate it. So let's do that with a number of popular beliefs and see where it leads. Consider the flying spaghetti monster. It's a joke. Just look up the history of it. It was a joke sent by Bobby Henderson to the Kansas Board of Education in January of the year 2005 because he disliked the idea of young Earth creationism being taught in schools. There is, therefore, no reason to consider whether this is true because it is merely a hypothetical created to illustrate a point. And we know how human beings create hypotheticals to illustrate points. Or again, consider the invisible pink unicorn. It, too, is a joke. This time, instead of being about creationism, it's a joke on the concept of a mystery. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what a mystery in the Christian sense actually is. For more on that, see my video, 2 Types of Contradictions. An overly short synopsis is that a Christian mystery is about things which have a different nature than we do, while the invisible pink unicorn is about attributing contradictory natures, of a sort that we're familiar with, to something. The invisible pink unicorn equally makes fun of the wave-particle duality of light, for example. And in any event, since we know why it has been talked about, we know not to consider whether it's real. It's not. This is not the case with the 5,000 gods that internet atheists are so impressed with, but we can deal with the 4,999 of them where God starts with a lowercase g pretty easily. They fall into, basically, 2 categories: mythologized heroes and personifications of nature. Of the first kind, mythologized heroes, Thor is a great example. No one ever thought that Thor created the universe. No one ever thought that he created so much as an island. He's a big guy with a hammer. If you're talking about the actual Norse mythology and not Marvel comic books, he can't even summon lightning. His association with thunder is that he hits the giants he fights so hard with his warhammer that it sounds like thunder. It seems overwhelmingly likely that there was a real Thor, millennia ago, who was very big and very strong, and who wielded a remarkably large warhammer. Then, legends grew up around him. You can see this basic phenomenon with Bruce Lee if you want a modern analog. And just like the cult of Bruce Lee, what you're basically left with on the question of how true are the beliefs about Thor is, who cares? If someone trains in Jeet Kune Do because he's inspired by Bruce Lee, or hits the gym a lot because he's inspired by Thor, okay. If someone prays to a shrine of Thor to help him with his 1-rep max on the bench press tomorrow, or to his life-size poster of Bruce Lee to help him with his sidekick on his belt test tomorrow, so what? It's not very different than asking a living mentor to wish them well on their lift or their test. If you believe in it and you're wrong, you're not very far off. If you don't believe in it and you're wrong, you've possibly missed a little bit of help on your lift or your belt test. It's just not very significant. The maximum error you can make here is tiny. The other kind of little g god, personifications of nature, are in a sense more complex and in a sense simpler. There is an aspect to these gods which is, of course, undeniably true. Helios, according to the Greeks, was the sun. They were, literally, worshipping the sun. That big, bright thing up in the sky during the day was the thing that they worshipped, according to them. But here we get to the complicated part. What did they mean by their personification of the sun? Now, don't forget that much of what is commonly thought of as Greek mythology is from poems and plays. basically the comic books and comic book movies of ancient times. If you want to see how disastrously wrong you can go trying to learn about religion from popular entertainment, check out my review of the movie Legion. The short answer is that we can't know for sure because, by definition, people only write down the text and not the subtext, but all modern analogs of personification, say when people are convinced that their computer or a traffic light hates them, point to personification being a way of describing that they don't understand the thing that they're personifying. Things are simple, people are complex. So describing a thing as a person is a way of saying that it's not actually simple. For a less universal, but closer modern analog, look at how people talk about the YouTube recommendation algorithm. It's just a program operating on a computer, but its behaviors are complex enough that people use phrases like, "it decides," "it likes you." For months it was trying to shove some channel down my throat. The people saying these things don't think that the algorithm has eyes and hands, but how much do they really consciously think of these things as purely metaphors? If you really look, you're going to find it's mixed. People easily forget that metaphors are metaphorical, but usually not completely. The personification of these forces of nature also allowed the practice of superstitions, which is an instinct people have for trying to control what they can't control in order to feel better. When you've planted your crops and done all you can do, things are now out of your hands, so it feels better to pour some wine on an altar to Demeter in hopes that nothing out of your control, such as root blight or a late frost, will go wrong. For a modern analog, look at people talking to their computer when it's not doing what they want, or better yet, how actors say break a leg to each other before a performance. It serves the same purpose as pouring wine on an altar to Demeter, though it is admittedly a bit cheaper. That's actors for you. So, what should we make of these things? Well, the thing about personifications of nature is that they are, fundamentally, natural. They have supernatural elements ascribed to them too, at least superficially, but when you describe Poseidon as quick to anger, you're really saying that the ocean can turn dangerous awfully fast. Which it can. So, there's an element to the gods as personifications of nature which is, poetically speaking, correct. This, by the way, is much of the appeal of Jordan Peterson. He teaches people how to understand the poetic meanings to this stuff. Okay, so that's partially right, but at the end of the day, is Poseidon real? Well, that's going to depend on what you mean. Is the sea real? Yes. Is much of what's said about Poseidon true of the sea? Yes. Should one worship Poseidon? No. This is where the pagans go wrong. However exactly you want to take these gods, whether you take the stories at face value or take them to be only metaphors, they too are still only creatures. They don't explain the world, and they don't explain themselves. Zeus was born, Poseidon was born, Gaia was born, and so it goes in every pagan mythology. Look all over the world, and you find the exact same thing over and over again. Sometimes the origins are quite explicit, like in Hesiod's Theogony. Sometimes they're far more implicit, like in, depending on how you want to look at it, Zoroastrianism. But none of them are supposed to be ultimate reality. They might possibly be worthy of reverence, but they're not worthy of worship. That only leaves the question of whether the superstition works. If the sea is rough, will pouring wine on an altar to Poseidon really calm it? The thing is, this is purely a practical matter. If you have no theory of the universe which rules out a sacrifice to Poseidon working, such as, say, Christianity, then either consult the general experience of humanity, which is that it doesn't do anything, or try it and see. Either way, if you're not a sailor, it doesn't matter what Poseidon thinks of you, and this is a completely moot point. So, bottom line, are these gods real? Kind of? Sort of? Not really. The fun stories are entertainment, and as valid as any other entertainment. The personifications of nature do express real truths, so there's something to learn from them in that limited sense. And the superstition is, like all superstitions, probably false. Superstitions are primarily an expression of the desire for control, not descriptions of the world. So, you see, without whining about people having to prove things to us, we've been able to think our way through things and make progress. The question is quite a lot simpler now. There really are just two alternatives, original Buddhism and God. Buddhism, at least what we can reconstruct of what Siddhartha Gautama taught, is an atheistic religion which holds that existence itself is an illusion. It's kind of analogous to the zero energy hypothesis, where gravity counts as a kind of negative energy, and so the universe doesn't really exist, it's just a temporary set of balancing loan and debt that will one day cancel out and go back to being nothing. Take your pick on how you want to express that the world isn't really here. It doesn't matter if you call this the realm of illusion, or a zero-energy universe, or particle and antiparticle that leapt fully formed out of the head of a quantum fluctuation. They're all the same idea, which crops up from time to time because everyone intuits, on some level, that you can't get something from nothing. So, this is one of the two major alternatives to consider. And then there's the other major alternative. God, with a capital G. The uncreated creator of all that is, the non-contingent source of all contingency, the reason why there is something rather than nothing. You will find different qualities attributed to God, especially with regard to his intellect, largely depending on what people think of human intellect, and with regard to his interaction with creation. But the uncreated creator of all that is uniquely identifies who is being talked about. Once you decide on which of these two alternatives is correct, you can proceed to figuring out more features of the truth, like whether you should be a hedonist or a Nietzschean on the one hand, or whether God ever directly interacted with history, and if so, what he did in history, on the other. Now, to be fair, deciding between these two alternatives is harder than evaluating the pagan gods. There are different ways of doing this. I suggest starting with whether you think that reason is valid. Only one of these two alternatives has the possibility of reason reflecting reality. Reason involves things like causality, logic, and so on. If the universe is here, or isn't really here but only appears to be here, for no reason, then reason doesn't reflect reality. The only possibility that reason actually reflects reality is that God created the universe so that effects have a cause and something didn't come from nothing. And this is as far as I can take you. Language is inherently rational, and you can't prove reason by a reasoned argument. You can't prove logic by a logical argument. That would just be circular. It would be reaching behind your back, grabbing your shirt, and picking yourself up by it. That only works in cartoons. What you've got to do is look at the world and decide for yourself whether reason is real or just the illusion of an ape whose ancestors had the trait of at least occasionally thinking logically and happened to survive to produce you. Possibly because that was useful in their environment, and possibly because it wasn't and they just got lucky. Is the world real or just an illusion? You're going to have to cast your lot with one of those two possibilities. I suggest spending some time thinking about them, then making a conscious decision, instead of just going with the flow of how your life has happened to go, up till now. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.